This is SSN.
Stories Studio Network.
The Change for Good Roads podcast series brings together influential Canadian experts from sectors of sustainable cities, equity, accessibility, physical activity, mobility, and road safety to discuss how to increase support for road safety action. Hosted by Parachute's President and CEO Pamela Fuselli, each episode will feature a discussion with an expert on urban road safety. Today we're going to dig deeper and explore the importance of multimodal transportation as a key component of healthy, active, and safe urban roads. We'll ask the question, what is multimodal transportation? Multimodal transportation has shared goals and benefits, not just for climate action, but also for public health, the local economy, and unsurprisingly, road safety. The Decade of Action for Road Safety 2021 to 2030 promotes multimodal transportation as an approach to make our roads safe. As advocates push for more multimodal transportation systems, there are increased numbers of pedestrians and cyclists on the road. It's important to consider these implications the systems have for the safety of road users who are vulnerable to injury. Joining me today is Dr. Kay Teschke. Dr. Teschke is a highly respected researcher in the field of cycling and transportation. She is currently Professor Emeritus at UBC's School of Population and Public Health, where she led the Cycling in Cities research program. This research made significant contributions to the scientific understanding of how to build cycling-friendly infrastructure. Dr. Teschke has been involved in the development of policies related to cycling at the municipal, provincial, national, and international levels. Her research has helped shape traffic laws and regulations, benchmarking, helmet laws, and the design of toolkits to create safer cycling environments. Kay, thanks so much for being part of Parachute's Change for Good Roads podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. Delighted to be here.
So let's start off with setting the stage. And how is multimodal transportation defined?
Well, really, it just means all modes of transportation. So we think often of transportation as private motor vehicles, but of course it should include also public transit, walking, biking, scootering, all the different modes that we have these days.
And there's more coming out, as you said, scootering. We've got different options that are, for short distances around urban environments. How might that work with smaller cities with limited public transportation?
Well, having lots of options is always a good, it's a good way to have almost anything. You want to have options. And I think one thing that we often forget when we think about people going around in cars is that there are whole segments of society that can't drive. People younger than 16 can't drive. Often older people can't drive. Many people with different kinds of disabilities can't drive. And if we don't design our transportation systems to allow all those possibilities, then we're leaving many people without the independence of travel. They're dependent on other people to drive them, which is such a shame. In certain cities, they've offered new ways of cycling. For example, offering for people with certain kinds of disabilities, trikes to get around on because they're more stable. And the comments you get from those folks is, oh, it's so great to be able to get around by myself and not wait for someone else to help me. And so for smaller cities or towns without public transport, walking, cycling, using wheelchairs, mobility scooters, all those other things are such a great alternative to being dependent on other people.
It really does impact your freedom to get involved with your community, not just to get from point A and point B and do your grocery shopping or those types of things, but also to interact with people in your community and the activities that you might want to do recreationally.
Yeah. That's another thing that people often talk about when they walk or bike or use some kind of mode of transport where they're not inside a motor vehicle is that they actually interact with other people. That's including transit. So all those other modes involve interacting with other people, give you the chance to stop and talk, say, oh yeah, I love your dog, and all those things that people do when they have that chance. And that's something that is rarely available for people driving.
Right. And I think we think about that getting from A to B and doing our list of chores or places that we have to go to, but having that face-to-face interaction, and especially over the last couple of years when that has been so limited, or the only opportunity you had to get out of the house was to do something like that, walk and bike around your neighborhood. I think the value of that maybe came more to the forefront of people's minds versus, their day-to-day lives where they were just trying to get to work and back again.
Totally true.
So how does multimodal transportation intersect with road safety?
In lots of different ways. One thing that I always like to mention when we're talking about multimodal, something that I don't think a lot of people realize, is that public transit is the safest mode of transport by far. So ground transport, I should say. Air transport is more. But as a mode of ground transport, it's between 10 and 25 times safer than driving. And so if you combine that, for example, with walking or biking to get to a transit stop, everyone pretty well needs to walk to one. It's actually a very, very safe combination. So that's one way. Another way is that when you have sidewalks and protected bike lanes, they tend to narrow down the street a bit. And when you do that, it is a way to slow driving down a little bit. Narrowing lanes is better than speed limits at slowing people down. And that's why in city centers and in Europe where streets are narrower, people tend to drive more slowly. That has a lot of benefits. I mean, if it reduces the chance of people being in a crash, and if there is a crash, it's going to cause fewer injuries because the speeds are slower and the transfer of energy is slower. So slower speeds are wonderful for everyone, for people in every mode of transport. It's safer for people walking, it's safer for people biking, and it's safer for people in cars. It also, if you have fewer crashes, the routes flow in a more predictable manner. So transportation is actually more efficient when it's safer. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize. But, we have a whole industry out there that deals with cars that have been in crashes. We have auto body repair firms. And then we have eye in the sky, people, in helicopters flying around looking for collisions, and we report on those. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could have our transportation moving smoothly so we're not constantly trying to get around crashes? And one way to do that is just to slow everything down a bit. Slower speed limits is also a great way to reduce crashes and make things safer for everyone.
And even if we're drivers, at some point we are pedestrians using the roads. So, right? You drive to a certain spot, and then you do have to walk, at least that last little bit. And I think as we look at the slower speeds and looking at the benefits of that ability to get around, as you said, that freedom. I don't know. I don't remember the last morning that I've woken up that I've not heard about crashes that have slowed down motorists and other people trying to get to and from point A and point B. So, it does really impact productivity, at the macro level.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I don't know the stats, unfortunately, for Ontario and Toronto, but in the area that I live in Vancouver, there are about 300,000 collisions a year. So it's hundreds, or around 100 a day. I mean, you can see how that easily fouls up traffic and makes things not move as smoothly as you'd want.
Exactly. And the impact on each of those individual lives. I mean, I think we think, oh, crash and you're treated and you go back to what you were doing before that crash. And that's very few times that actually is the case. So what are some examples of effective multimodal transportation interventions?
Well, there's no question that the best interventions, the ones that actually are what we call in public health primary prevention, things that stop the crash from happening in the first place, are to do with infrastructure design. So the way that transportation engineers and planners design our roads. And one of my favorite ones for people cycling, but also people on scooters and wheelchairs and other mobility aids, is protected bike lanes. So that's a bike lane that has some kind of physical barrier between the lane for people on bikes and the lanes for moving motor vehicle traffic. So a physical barrier. And in our research, we found that reduced the risk of an injury to people on bikes by about tenfold. So it's a huge reduction in risk, and that prevents injuries to every part of your body and, of course, allows you to continue on your way. The other thing about that type of solution for people cycling is that to encourage people to be willing to bike, it's absolutely necessary, especially women who cycle much less frequently in North America than men. About a third of people cycling tend to be women, about 2/3 men, whereas in safe Northern European countries, it's 50-50, as it should be. And to make it safer for women, they need to feel that they're separated from traffic. The other big group that feels exactly the same as women, which includes a lot of men, is people with children. Mm-hmm. So once you become a parent, your attitude towards being willing to ride in that painted bike lane or just willing to ride in the lane with moving car traffic just disappears. Mm-hmm. You want to be able to live so that your child gets to know you later in life. So, yeah. And you also don't want to ride in those kind of situations with your children. So, yes, physically separated bike lanes. Another thing that I think is super important and very effective infrastructure for people walking, but it also can accommodate people biking, and that is at intersections. So if you think of a main street and you're walking along on the sidewalk and you come to the intersection with, a residential street, but you're going to continue straight along that main street. You need to step down off the curb, and I guarantee that most people, before they step down off that curb, they're looking for people driving, turning, say, right in front of you. And yet, if you think about it, you're walking along that main street, and so you should have the right of way. And in countries like Holland, what they do right at that kind of intersection is they keep the sidewalk at that same level. So it's called a raised crossing. So your sidewalk that's going along the main street stays at the same height right across. So when someone is driving and turning off the main street onto the residential street, they have to go, oh, wait a minute. That person on walking has the right of way, just the same as if I were going straight. I would have the right of way. But now I'm turning onto this residential street. I see this, basically it's like a crosswalk size speed hump. I see this speed hump. I need to stop, slow down, wait and see if anyone's crossing. And then I know I'm going to cross the speed hump. I'm going into some place different. I'm going into a residential neighborhood. It's quieter. I need to think about driving here differently than I did on the main street. Those raised crossings can work also for the bike lanes. So for both people walking and biking or in wheelchairs and so on, that raised crossing, it makes a huge difference. It can reduce the risk of a crash at an intersection by about 50%. So really a terrific intervention, very common in Holland, that you almost don't notice that you're coming to an intersection because it just continues. But it is an intersection, and the people driving understand that they have to slow before they turn.
I think that brings up, that concept of sharing the roads, of changing the culture on the way that drivers think about how they use the roads, and that they are not the primary focus of the roadways, that there's other non-car users that have just as much right to be there. And I think for the folks that are driving now, I mean, they don't really get the concept that, roads were in fact initially not for cars, and that they were for cyclists and, pedestrians and streetcars and way back horse and buggies and things like that. But that this is these roadways are meant for all road users to be able to get around and get to where they want to go and back again safely. So how do we help to change that culture on the way that drivers think about their position on the roads, if you will?
You said it so well. I was going to talk about the fact that roads were not built for private motor vehicles. Private motor vehicles are new. Roads are ancient. And certainly initially built just for walking, and then slowly but surely some added different types of mobility aids started coming along. But private motor vehicles are the most recent of those. So yes, understanding that roads they're hugely expensive and very valuable public resource. And they need to be available for everyone. And I think most people, especially in your residential street where you live, a lot of people are still old enough, like I am, to remember playing on the street as a kid. And there's a tendency to think of every road as just for people driving. And it would be really great if we got back, at least in residential areas, to slowing down the traffic so much that people really could feel like they could use it for many things. Sometimes people use the block off their block and have a street party. Isn't that wonderful? Sometimes we do it as, a whole city event on a major street. But having those options, and, when those things happen, don't we all love them? They're so great. And that territory, that road territory, is such a valuable public resource. And I think the more we do these other kinds of activities on our streets, the more people realize what a great resource. One thing that happened in the pandemic on main streets is we started restaurants started taking parking spaces and putting outdoor seating along those parking spaces. And again, that's another great example of a different use for the public sphere that is a roadway.
Yeah, there's a number of different examples around policy development or implementation like that, with, taking back some of the road space for dedicated bike lanes, widening the sidewalks where people can walk, having those types of social things like restaurant patios that really support that cycling, multimodal transportation at various levels. And when people get used to them, they start to understand that even though there are fewer or more narrow car or lanes for cars, it actually doesn't add that much to the overall trip, because that's one of the major complaints with drivers, right? It's hard enough to get around as it is. If you take away a lane of traffic, it's just going to make it that much longer for me. What are some examples, or maybe one example of policy, either at the municipal, provincial, or national level that you think has been really important around promoting multimodal transportation?
Well, for sure, the best is the infrastructure changes that I already mentioned. So protected bike lanes, proper sidewalks on every street, those things make a huge difference to people's willingness to bike or walk or scoot. Something that started to happen both at the provincial level and at the federal level after a lot of lobbying is grants to build some of that infrastructure. And with new guidelines about how to build that kind of infrastructure. So one of the things that we have noticed, we've surveyed municipal personnel, engineers, and planners in different size cities. And we find that the ones in the small cities and towns don't have a clue how to build the best infrastructure, and they also don't know the scientific evidence of what works, both to make them safer and to encourage people to be more active in their way of getting around. And so if provincial government here in BC, they did it, but I think there's also the same thing is happening at the federal level, developing guidelines. Here are the best practices for designing and building good routes that encourage people to use these modes. And I think giving the grants with those guidelines in mind is really great, because a lot of places spent money on some not very useful infrastructure like painted bike lanes, and then they wondered why it wasn't being used. So that's a very helpful process for both the federal and provincial governments to adopt.
Yeah, and I think what we found at Parachute as we looked at multi-sectoral intersections, if you will, if I can use a road analogy, that a number of these infrastructure changes or other changes, don't just address some of the injuries on our roads, but it increases healthy, active living that's good for physical health and mental health. It actually is one of the solutions that people looking at climate change and environmental impacts also are calling for. And so I think on the one side, outside of government, there's a number of groups and sectors that can work together for change that is stronger because we're together. But also when governments make these kinds of policy changes and infrastructure changes, they're actually addressing a number of different societal issues at the same time. So it's sort of a win-win-win all around.
I know it is so amazing when you list all the things that are benefited from people walking and biking. It's just a huge long list. Lower noise, lower air pollution, less congestion on city streets. But the one that I really think is so important, and it goes to mental health, but in a way, saying mental health doesn't describe it. It's that walking and biking are fun. And, when I ride, I just think, I pass so many people with big smiles on their faces. And of course, now with electric bikes, there's even more, because people like to be able to get that a little bit more speed with a little less effort. It's just so much fun. There's a physician group called the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and they started an initiative for family docs to prescribe time outside, because there have been so many studies showing that many types of physical and mental health are benefited as much or more by the simple act of being outside, walking, biking, and so on. So they've started that movement, and it's gotten attention, not just throughout Canada, but in other parts of the world. And so, yeah, transportation engineers, you too can be public health officials.
Exactly. Well, that's a great way to close out our discussion, our chat. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been really interesting, and it just shows how much we can achieve with even just this small starting spot on so many different levels. So thanks for sharing all your expertise and your experience in this area.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. Change for Good Roads is a podcast of Parachute, Canada's national injury prevention charity, whose mission is for Canadians to live long lives to the fullest by preventing serious and fatal injuries. We release episodes of this podcast monthly on the second Tuesday of the month. Change for Good Roads is made possible through the generous support of our road safety partner, Desjardins Insurance. On the next episode, we'll be talking about the global perspective on road safety. You can find the Change for Good Roads podcast on Spotify and Apple iTunes. Make sure to use the hashtag #ChangeForGoodRoads when you share the podcast with others on social media or by sending a link out to your networks. Subscribing to the podcast and giving it a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts will also help listeners find this podcast.
This is Story Studio Network.